We continue our lectures in a theoretical course of English grammar. The topic of today's lecture is verb as the central part of speech and its different classifications. Grammatically, verbs are the most complex part of speech. This is due to the central role they play in the expression of predicativity of the sentence, establishing the relationship between the target situation or event named in the utterance and the speech act. Besides this, the finite verb, being the center of predication, determines with its semantics the configuration of the sentence, specifying meaning relationships among its components. The centrality of the verb is also conditioned by the complex system of its grammatical categories, as well as by various classifications of verbs according to their functional, semantic, structural, and valency characteristics. The first type of classification we want to focus on is functional classification of verbs. According to their functions, verbs can be divided into three major categories or classes: lexical or full verbs, primary verbs, and auxiliary modal verbs. The grammatical categorical meaning of lexical or full verbs is to denote action, process, or state dynamically, that is, developing in time. The full verbs are only used as main verbs because of their lexical meaning. For instance, every morning he goes to the office and comes back at 8. Now, this class of verbs is an open class of words, since the English language is always adding new lexical verbs to designate new concepts. For instance, to download, to upload, to email, etc. The second functional class of verbs is introduced by the primary verbs. There are only three primary verbs in English: be, have, and do, the most common verbs in modern English. And these verbs form a separate class because they can be used either as main verbs or as auxiliary verbs. Primary verbs can act as main verbs when they realize their lexical meaning of existence, possession, and acting or performing something, as for instance in the sentences: he was in the hotel with his family, or he has a big family, a wife and 6 children, or they did everything to save the child. Special attention should be paid to the primary verb be. Opinions differ concerning its functional status. British and American scholars consider that when be is used as a copula, that's a linking verb, as for instance he is angry or he's a dancer, it functions as a main verb, while Russian linguists refer to such use of be as a pure link verb, connecting the subject with its predicate. When the primary verbs lose their lexical meaning, they are used as auxiliaries to show how the main verb is to be understood. The auxiliary have is used to form the perfect aspect. For instance, I have just come home. The auxiliary be is used to form the progressive or continuous aspect, as he is having his lunch, and to form the passive voice, as the letter was sent to him. The auxiliary do is used in negative statements and in questions, and this is known as do insertion. For instance, where do you live? Or he does not speak French at all. The third functional group of verbs comprises modal verbs such as can, may, must, could, might, have to, be able to, shall, will, should, would, need, etc., which are used only as auxiliary verbs to express ability, possibility, obligation, necessity, volition or prediction of the action, process or state which is denoted by the main verb. For instance, in the sentence, people thought he might have been joking, the modal might expresses possibility, whereas in the next sentence, he would probably go there. The modal would already expresses prediction of the action denoted by the modal main verb. The second classification of verbs is semantic classification. American and British linguists differentiate 7 semantic classes of English lexical or full verbs. They are activity verbs, communication verbs, mental verbs, causative verbs, verbs of occurrence, verbs of existence or relationship, and verbs of aspect. Activity verbs usually refer to an action performed intentionally by an agent or doer. Thus, in the following example, the subject performs the action which is underlined in the sentence. He bought biscuits and condensed milk. According to Biber, Conrad and Leach, the 20 most commonly used activity verbs in conversation, fiction, newspaper writing, and academic prose are bring, get, make, play, take, buy, give, meet, put, try, come, go, move, run, use, follow, leave, pay, show, and work. Communication verbs form a special subclass of activity verbs that involve communication activities, particularly verbs describing speaking and writing. For instance, you said you did not have it. The 12 most commonly used communication verbs are ask, talk, call, say, tell, claim, speak, shout, thank, describe, suggest, write, and offer. Mental verbs refer to mental states and activities. Mental verbs express a wide range of meanings such as mental states or processes such as like think, know, believe, etc. Attitudes or desires such as love, want, wish, need, etc. Perceptions such as feel, see, touch, taste and smell. Emotional attitudes, hate, like, love, and so on. Corpus-based grammar offers the list of 20 most frequently used mental verbs. They are believe, feel, think, listen, read, consider, hear, love, remember, expect, see, understand, know, mean, want, like, find, need, suppose, and wonder. Causative verbs are represented by such verbs as allow, let, enable, require, cause, force, and help, which indicate that some person or thing helps bring about a new state of affairs. These verbs often occur with a derived noun as the direct object, which reports the action or event that was facilitated, as in the examples below, where such an object, that's complement, is underlined. For instance, this information enables the formulation of precise questions, or still other rules cause the deletion of elements from the structure. Verbs of occurrence report events that occur without an actor. 7 verbs of occurrence are especially common in English: become, grow, change, happen, develop, occur, die, change, etc. For instance, the lights have changed, or the incident occurred many years ago. The 6th group of verbs is represented by verbs of existence or relationship that report a state of existence or a logical relationship which exists between entities. Some of the most common existence verbs are copular verbs such as be, seem, appear, go, grow, look, feel, sound, smell, taste, remain, keep, turn, get, become, prove, and so on. For instance, witnesses said he appeared happy and relaxed, or it was growing dark when we set out. And the last group of verbs is represented by verbs of aspect, characterizing the stage of progress of an event or activity. These verbs usually occur with a non-finite complement clause following the verb. Some common aspect verbs in English are begin, start, commence, continue, proceed, keep, go on, stop, give up, etc. For instance, he could not stop talking about me, or tears started to trickle down his cheeks. The third classification of verbs is morphological classification. Verbs traditionally fall into two sets of morphological classes: regular and irregular verbs and finite and non-finite verbs. The main principle of the morphological classification of verbs is the way how they form simple past and past participle forms. Accordingly, verbs are divided into two large groups: regular and irregular verbs. Regular verbs form past participle and past simple by adding the inflectional suffix ed, while irregular verbs form these forms individually. English irregular verbs can be differentiated into the following subgroups. Number 1. Verbs that form simple past and participle 2 by means of vowel gradation. For instance, drink, drank, drunk, begin, began, begun, sing, sang, sung, sink, sank, sunk, etc. Number 2. Verbs with vowel gradation plus affixation for participle 2. For instance, break, broke, broken, give, gave, given, take, took, taken, write, wrote, written, etc. Number 3. Verbs with vowel gradation plus the same suffixation forms for simple past and past participle. For instance, bring, brought, brought, buy, bought, bought, catch, cut, cut, teach, taught, taught, etc. The first group comprises verbs with consonant gradations such as build, built, built, lend, lent, lent, send, sent, sent, etc. The fifth group includes the verbs with homonymous forms such as burst, 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 let, 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 cut, 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 set, 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 and so on. And the last group is represented by the verbs with suppletive forms such as be, was, were, been, and go and went. The second morphological classification of verbs is based on the discrimination between their finite and non-finite forms. They differ both in the number of the categories they possess and in their syntactical functions. There are three non-finite forms of the verb in English: the infinitive, the participle, and the gerund. The participle has two forms: participle 1 or present participle, which is formed with the help of the inflectional suffix ing, as in dancing, singing, etc., and participle 2 or past participle with the inflectional suffix ed for the regular verbs and other means of word forming for irregular verbs such as danced, brought, taken, etc. Finite forms are distinguished from the non-finite as follows. Finite verbs can occur only independently as a simple predicate without copula verbs or modal auxiliaries. For instance, Nick speaks 5 languages, while non-finite verb forms can function as part of a complex verbal predicate, as in Nick can speak 5 languages. They can also perform other syntactic functions in a sentence. The most common functions of non-finite forms are the following. Nick can speak 5 languages. In this sentence, infinitive functions as a part of a compound modal verbal predicate. The second typical function of non-finite forms is for gerund, the function of a subject, as dancing is my favorite pastime. Gerund as a direct object, as in I like dancing. Participle 1 as an adverbial modifier of attending circumstances, as in this sentence, he sat on the sofa reading a book. Or participle 1 as an attribute, he saw a dancing girl. Participle 2 as an attribute, there was a broken vase in the box, and so on. Finite verbs have tense contrast, that is, the distinction between present and past tenses. For instance, he works hard and he worked hard, while non-finite verb forms don't have any tense distinction. In other words, they don't have the grammatical category of tense. Finite verbs have grammatical categories of person and number, while non-finite verbs don't have any of these distinctions. There is a person and number concord between the subject of a clause and the finite simple verbal predicate. This concord is particularly clear with the present tense of the verb be. I am, you are, he is, she is, it is, we are, you are, they are. But with most full verbs, outward concord is restricted to a contrast between the third person singular present and other persons or plural noun number. For instance, he, she, or Jim reads the paper every morning, but I, we, you, and they read the paper every morning. Both finite and non-finite verbs have different grammatical forms for aspect distinction. Aspect requires a choice between the non-perfect and the perfect forms on the one hand, and between the non-progressive and progressive forms on the other hand. You can compare these forms. For instance, finite verb forms for the aspect are: he writes poems. That's simple verb form, non-perfect, non-progressive. He has written poems. Perfect form, auxiliary have plus participle 2, non-progressive. He is writing poems. Progressive form with auxiliary be plus participle 1 and non-perfect form. He has been writing poems, both perfect and progressive forms. Non-finite verb forms for the aspect so are represented by the example with the auxiliary must plus bare infinitive. For instance, he must write poems, bare infinitive, simple, non-perfect, non-progressive. He must have written poems, bare infinitive, perfect, non-progressive. He must be writing poems, bare infinitive, progressive, non-perfect. He must have been writing poems, bare infinitive, perfect, progressive. Both finite and non-finite verbs, except the gerund, have different grammatical forms for voice distinction. Voice involves a contrast between active and passive. The active form of the verb shows that the action denoted by it is performed by the subject of the sentence, while the passive form indicates that the action is performed upon the subject. For instance, he writes poems active. Poems must be written by him passive. He has written poems active, and Poems must have been written by him, passive, and so on. And finally, finite verbs have different forms to mark the grammatical category of mood, which requires a choice between the indicative, imperative, and subjective mood, while non-finite verb forms are devoid of this grammatical category. Due to the above-mentioned grammatical categories of tense, person, number, aspect, voice, and mood, finite verbs are capable to perform independently syntactic function of a simple predicate in a sentence, whereas the number of these categories being restricted to aspect and voice, non-finite verb forms are devoid of this feature. The fourth group of verbs is structural classes, classification of verbs. According to their structure, English verbs are divided into simple, that's root verbs, derived verbs, compound or composite verbs, and phrasal verbs. Simple or root verbs consist of a content morpheme that cannot be analyzed any further into smaller parts. Such verbs are not numerous. For instance, ask, go, play, take, tell, declare, and so on. Derived verbs fall into four subclasses according to their word-building peculiarities. The first group is represented by derived verbs which are formed by means of conversion or zero suffixation. The most common type of conversion is noun-verb conversion, such as a cloud to cloud, a house to house, a park to park, etc. To park, etc. The second group is represented by the sound-replacing type of derivation, such as food and to feed, blood to bleed, etc. The third group comprises the derivative verbs with stress-replacing type of derivation. For instance, import, noun, and to import verb, transport and transport, etc. And the last group is derived verbs which are formed by means of affixation, a root morpheme plus an affix, prefix, or suffix. They represent the most common type of derivation. There are many different derivational prefixes used to form new verbs in English. For instance, rebuild, rename, disarm, dislike, overeat, overtire, unload, unfold, misinform, misunderstand, outbid, outdo, etc., whereas there are only a few derivational suffixes, such as realize, stabilize, activate, beautify, lengthen, moisten, etc. Compound or composite verbs consist of two or more roots, such as blackmail, broadcast, whitewash, etc. Phrasal verbs are represented by two specific types. The first type is a combination of the head verb have, give and talk, occasionally some others with a noun. This type of phrasal verbs has as its equivalent an ordinary simple verb. For instance, to have a smoke, to smoke, to give a smile, to smile, to take a stroll, to stroll, to have a look at, etc. The second of phrasal verbs is a combination of a head verb with a preposition that has a specifying value determining the semantics of the whole phrase. For instance, look at, look after, look for, look through, look up, or give in, give away, give off, give out, give over, give up, and so on. The fifth classification of words is according to valency patterns. The finite verb, being the central predication, organizes all the sentence constituents. In other words, the main verb with its semantics determines the configuration of other elements that are required in the sentence. This combining power of the verb is called valency. The pattern of the sentence elements is called the valency pattern of the verb. The patterns are differentiated by the required elements that follow the verb within the sentence: the subject, direct and indirect objects, adverbials, etc. All valency patterns include a subject, while optional adverbials can always be added. British and American grammarians differentiate 5 major valency patterns: intransitive, monotransitive, ditransitive, complex transitive, and copular patterns. Intransitive pattern is a combination of the subject and the main verb. Intransitive verbs occur with no obligatory element following the verb. For instance, more people came, or he sleeps badly. Monotransitive pattern represents a subject-verb combination with a direct object that's complement. Monotransitive verbs occur with a single direct object. For instance, she was carrying a heavy bag, or Tom has built a new house. The transitive pattern represents a subject-verb combination with 2 object phrases, an indirect object followed by a direct object. For instance, his father gave him the money. They called him Johnny. Complex transitive patterns are represented by 2 types in which a transitive verb occurs with a direct object followed either by an object predicative expressed by an adjective, as in the boy made his mother angry, or by an obligatory adverbial, as in this example, he put his hand on the child's shoulder. Copular pattern represents a combination of a subject and a copular verb followed by a predicative which is expressed by a noun, adjective, adverb, or prepositional phrase. For instance, he was a school teacher then. In this sentence we have noun in the functional predicative, Carrie felt a little less bold, adjective as a predicative, she felt well, adverb as a predicative. The monotransitive, ditransitive, and complex transitive patterns are the transitive patterns as they all require some type of object. The most common structure for the object is a noun phrase. However, in some cases, other structures, such as the complement clause, can function as a direct object. For instance, we often meet a monotransitive pattern with a complement clause for the direct object, as in this sentence. He said he was going to make a copy. There is also a frequent use of a ditransitive pattern with a noun or pronoun for the indirect object and a complement clause for the direct one. For instance, the staff in the information office told me that the train had been delayed until 18:15. Verbs in all patterns can occur with optional adverbials, which are called adverbial supplements. For instance, we have adverbial supplements of place and time in the following sentences. He went to the corner shop. So in this sentence, we have adverbial modifier of place, or he left the office at 6 o'clock, where we have adverbial modifier of time. Thus, we have discussed the verb as the central part of speech, focusing on its organizing role in the configuration of a sentence. We have also reviewed different classifications of verbs according to their functional, structural, morphological, semantic, and valency characteristics, through which the linguistic peculiarities of the verb are manifested in its complexity. So,